Welcome back to our genetics section, and we are going to continue on with this unit, and we're now going to start getting into some of the actual problems. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about Gregor Mendel, some of his ideas, his law of dominance, his law of segregation and independent assortment. We've talked about some of the terminology that you're going to need to use in this unit, like genotype versus phenotype, and if that's a little confusing right now, hopefully as we go through some of these problems, it'll make some more sense. We've also talked about the idea of homozygous versus heterozygous, dominant versus recessive. And now we're going to take all that information and we're going to use it to try to solve some problems. And that's pretty much what we're going to be doing for the rest of this section. We're going to be going through a bunch of different types of genetics problems. Some of them you might have learned before. So this first bit here, which we're going to talk about, is called a monohybrid cross. Now, these you should have some experience with, I believe, from middle school. So hopefully this sounds like somewhat of a review for you. And then as we get into some of the more complex questions, you'll probably find it to be a little more challenging and an extension of what you already know. So let's get started with the first most basic type of genetics problem, which is a monohybrid cross, right? So a mono means one, right? And in this case here, hybrid refers to trait. So a monohybrid cross is we're looking at one single trait. Now, that is not common in very complex organisms. Usually, traits kind of come in groups. They come together in something called a polygenic trait. So for example, eye color, it's not like in humans there's just two eye colors, brown and blue, right? There's lots of different eye color. There's brownish, there's gray, there's blue, there's green. And if you really look at someone's eye, you'll see that it's not a solid color at all. It's a lot of different colors mixed together. And then what your eye picks up is just kind of a combination of those colors, and it looks blue or green. Hair color is another great example. It's not brown or blonde. There's a lot of variation there. So when I talk about a monohybrid cross, that's pretty rare in complex organisms like humans, but it does exist in some species. So we'll talk about that. So a monohybrid cross deals with one trait. So let's look at our first problem here. The first problem we're going to look at deals with summer squash, which is just a type of vegetable, zucchini. You've seen them before. And I'm going to read the problem, and then we're going to do it together, and then I'm going to give you a couple examples, and then hopefully you will understand it well enough to try some on your own. So this question asks, in summer squash, white fruit color, big W, is dominant over yellow fruit color, little w. If a squash plant is homozygous for white and is crossed with a plant that is homozygous for yellow, what will be the phenotypic and genotypic ratios? Whoa, what the heck is that, right? So let's take it and let's break it down. I'm going to switch up to a different format so we can do this a little easier. So if you take a look here, I have that same question, but I have it written down here. In summer squash, white fruit color is dominant over yellow fruit color. If a squash plant homozygous for white is crossed with a plant homozygous for yellow, what would be the phenotypic and genotypic ratios? Now, I know there's a lot going on here. I have all these W's. That's just because it's hard to write on this, so I thought it was easier for me to have all of it here in place. So don't worry about all these W's. If it's throwing you off, just ignore it for now. What do you do when you see a problem like this? Well, the first thing you need to do, these are math problems, essentially. And these are a lot like the word problems you would have in math class. And I know everybody probably is groaning right now because word problems are pretty challenging. The trick to a word problem is you got to figure out what the question is asking, right? So that's the first thing you want to look at. So if I take a look here, it's telling me the scenario, and then the last thing it's asking is what are the phenotypic and genotypic ratios? That's what we want to find in this problem. So we haven't really talked about that yet, and we're going to do that now. So first of all, there are three possible genotypes when we're talking about summer squash. You could have homozygous dominant, which would be big W, big W. You could have heterozygous, which would be big W, little w. And you could have homozygous recessive, which would be little w, little w. Now, hopefully you remember from the last couple lectures that the heterozygous, if it's a dominant trait, so what it is telling you here is white fruit color, big W is dominant over yellow fruit color. So what that means is if a big W is there, it's going to exhibit that trait. So if I look at these three examples here, these are the three possibilities. There's no other possibilities. I know that big W is going to give me white because it's dominant. I know that big W, little w is also going to give me white because the big W overpowers the little w. That's the law of dominance. If the big W is there, if the dominant allele is there, it overpowers the recessive allele. And then the only way you're going to get a yellow plant, if you look here, it says yellow fruit color, little w, is if it's little w, little w. So the first thing I need to figure out is what are these two parents? What are their genotypes? So it tells you white fruit color is dominant over yellow. So if a squash plant is homozygous for white, homo means same, white is dominant. So that tells us that the first parent is going to be big W, big W. And I know that because homo means same and dominant is going to be the white. It is crossed with a plant that is homozygous for yellow. So homozygous for yellow, homo means same, but now we know yellow is going to be the recessive allele, so that is going to be little w, little w. So I want to know what is going to happen in a cross between these two parents. So I'm going to come over to our trusty little Punnett square here. So how do you fill in a Punnett square? The way you fill in a Punnett square is one parent goes on one side, and the other parent goes on the other side. It doesn't really matter where you put them. So I'm going to put the first one over here. So we're going to put the white plant on the top, and we're going to put the yellow plant on the side. So now I have my Punnett square set up, and now we want to see what are the outcomes going to be. So this one is going to translate to these two boxes here, right? So we got our big W and our big W here from this box. And then I'm going to go to this one here, and that's going to go to these two. So I got my big W and my big W. And now we have the other parent. This little w is going to go to these two boxes. Little w, little w. And then here we have our last little w here, little w here. And what we have now is our completed Punnett square. These are the four possible outcomes that could come when I combine these two parents. Now, this question, we got all four the same. So we're going to talk about ratios now. A ratio is a way to compare different values to each other. So for example, if I were to be in class right now and I said, what's the ratio of boys to girls, you would count up the number of boys and you would compare them to the number of girls. So a genotypic ratio is the same idea, except we're comparing genotypes. I want to know what's the ratio of big W, or homozygous dominant, to big W, little w, or heterozygous, to little w, which would be homozygous recessive. So how I would do that is I would just count it up, right? So how many of these boxes have big W, big W? Well, hopefully you're taking a look here and you're seeing the answer is 0. So I'm going to write a 0 here because there's no homozygous dominant. The second one is heterozygous, big W, little w. So I take a look here and I have 1, 2, 3, 4. All four boxes are going to be heterozygous, so it's going to be a 4. And then finally, I mean, I could figure it out without counting because there's none left. There's only 4 boxes, and I already have 4 here. But how many of these have little w? The answer to that would be 0. So it's a 0 to 4 to 0 ratio for the genotypic ratio. Now, the phenotypic ratio, remember, genotype is what its gene is. The phenotypic ratio is the trait. So I want to know white to yellow, so dominant to recessive. So in the case of this problem, it's going to be, you can see why I put all those W's out there because it's not the easiest thing to write with. White to, yeah, I'm just going to put a Y for yellow. White to yellow. So I want to know how many are dominant, how many are recessive. So if I take a look here, how many of these boxes are going to be white in color? Well, remember, big W is white, but so is big W, little w. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, and I get 4 dominant to how many are recessive? 0. So the answer to this question, which it asked up here, is what is the genotypic and phenotypic ratios? Here's your answer right here. The genotypic is going to be 0 to 4 to 0, and the phenotypic is going to be 4 to 0. Now, one little trick when you're doing these two are always going to be and this is a complete dominance problem, as long as they're completely dominant, are going to equal the dominant. And then the recessive is going to be this one right here. So if I look here, I got 4 and 4. So I got it right. Let's look at the next question. Same exact scenario, but I want to know what happens if I have 2 heterozygous white plants crossed, and I want to know what those ratios are going to be. So I'm going to just reverse this whole problem. Sorry if hopefully you got down everything you need to get down. So now I want to know what would happen in a cross between 2 heterozygous parents. So heterozygous white. So that's going to be this option here. So one parent's going to be big W, little w. and the other parent is going to be big W, little w. And I know that because hetero means different, so heterozygous is going to be 2 heterozygous white plants. So let's throw them in there and get our cross. So this first box, we're going to do our big W's here. Big W. Now, one thing I want to point out while I'm doing this is the dominant is always going to go in front. The big letter is always going to go in front. So here we have little w, little w. Notice I put them on the right side here because I know that the big W is going to come in front of it. And then we have little w, and we have our completed Punnett square. So now we're going to do our genotypic and phenotypic ratio again. And how many of these are big W, big W? Well, now this box has 1. So we have 1. How many are going to be big W, little w? That one and that one. So we have 2. And then finally, we have 1 that is little w, little w. So the answer to this one would be a 1 to 2 to 1 genotypic ratio. Now for our phenotypic ratio of white to yellow, because white is dominant, I'm going to take a look here. I'm going to see big W, dominant overpowers the dominant. They're both dominant, so that's going to be 1. In this one, big dominates little, so that's going to be 2. Big dominates little is going to be 3. Now this one's not dominant, so we have 3 dominant, 2, how many recessive? 1 recessive. So if I take a look here, the dominant to recessive is going to be 3 to 1 ratio. And if I go to that little trick again, 1 and 2 are going to equal 3, right? Because the first 2 are dominant, and that 1 is the same. Okay, we're going to do one more just to make sure everyone's okay, and then that'll be it for today with this at least. Okay, so normal vision is dominant to color blindness. What are the chances that a heterozygous normal man and a colorblind woman will have a child with color blindness? So big N is dominant to little n, so that is going to be, big N is going to be normal vision, and little n is going to be color blindness. So this is going to be colorblind here, colorblind, and then these two are going to be normal. So first off, I have a heterozygous normal man. So he's normal, so he's one of these two, but it tells you it's heterozygous. So I know the dad is going to be big N, little n. And the mom is colorblind. Well, there's only one option for colorblind, little n, little n. So that's the mother. So we'll put them on the Punnett square. Now again, it doesn't matter where you put the letters as long as they're together. So for example, the father's here and the mother's here, but I could have just as easily put the big N, little n here and the little n there. So we're going to plug this in real quick. And I'm going through this a little quickly because I'm trying to finish up here, but you'll... Okay. And now the question, oh, I'm going to steal one from over here. I didn't make enough ends. Okay. So I want to know, what is the chance that they'll have a child who is colorblind? So it's not asking for the ratios. So I just have to take a look now. So what are the chances? Well, if I take a look, I'm going to do the ratios just for the sake of it. I have 0 big N, big N's, 2 big N, little n, or heterozygous, and 2 little n, little n. And then dominant to recessive is going to be 2 to 2 because we have 2 dominants and 2 recessives. So I want to know, what's the chance that they're going to have a child who has color blindness? Well, 2 to 2 is going to be a 50% chance. So the answer to this question is a 50% chance of these 2 individuals having a child with color blindness. Okay, that was pretty quick, but that's how we do those problems. Now, ideally, I would ask if anybody had any questions right now, but I can't do that. So I'm going to, hopefully, you'll email me if you have a question, and I will hopefully be able to answer it for you. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. I'm going to send you out some problems to try on your own, and try them and see how you do. And if you need help, please email me.